Before we start this story, I want to leave an important message. Here on the channel Plow of Twist, we support justice and equality, and are against any form of discrimination or racism. We know that the fight for respect and dignity is constant, and we want you to feel supported and valued. Your voice matters, your story matters, and together we can make a difference. Now, get ready for an exciting plot full of twists and turns. Subscribe to the channel, activate the bell and enjoy the story. Have a good journey. A white police officer, in an impeccable uniform, cold eyes and a slight arrogant smile on his face, stops a luxury car in the middle of a busy street. It was an ordinary night, nothing extraordinary. What did he see in front of him? Just another well-dressed black woman behind the wheel of a car that, in her mind, shouldn't belong to someone like her. He approaches slowly. The sound of your footsteps echoes in the silent night. The woman, serene, keeps her hands firmly on the steering wheel. She already knew what was coming. It wasn't the first time. But this time, something was about to be different. Something that would change both of their lives forever. Documents, he says, without emotion, as if the scene had already been repeated in his head hundreds of times. He had already decided what would happen. She, however, didn't know. The woman hands over the documents without hesitation. His gaze is steady, controlled, but there is something in his eyes that the policeman doesn't notice, a flame, a silent anger. He starts going through the car, pretending to do a routine check, but in reality, he was planting evidence. A small package falls from his hand, sliding under the passenger seat. "It looks like we have a problem here, ma'am," he says, with a cold smile as he stands up, displaying the contents he had just found. She looks at him without blinking. The tension in the air is palpable, like a taut rope about to snap. The police officer, believing he has complete control of the situation, decides to go further. He knew no one would believe her, he had the power, the badge, the word of the law, on his side. "I don't know where this came from, but," she begins to speak, with a calmness that only increases his arrogance. "I know very well where it came from. This right here is evidence." "And now, you're going to the police station," he interrupts, triumphantly. It was his game, his system. "I had done this before, and always came out on top. Why would this time be different?" The woman takes a deep breath, her eyes fixed on his. She was tired of being treated like this, of being seen as less, of being humiliated just for the color of her skin. But this time, the police officer was about to discover something he would never have imagined. He didn't know who he was dealing with. And what she did to him in the days that followed was something he would never forget. The officer had no idea that the woman before him was much more than she appeared to be. She had the power to destroy everything he had built, everything he thought he controlled. Unbeknownst to him, she possessed a crucial piece of information, a secret from his past that had been buried but now, in the face of this injustice, was about to emerge. And when that happened, he would realize how deeply he had underestimated this woman. But that night, he felt invincible. For him, she was just one of many. Someone he could throw into the system, crush, and move on as if nothing had happened. He had no idea that the past was about to come back to haunt him, that his world was about to fall apart in ways he never expected. The humiliation she suffered that night was the catalyst. She saw her dignity being trampled, her pride being crushed, but silently, she planned. And when the truth finally came out, it would be far more devastating than he could have ever imagined. "Do you know what you just did?" she asked, with a calm and controlled voice, which hid the storm that was forming inside her. He laughed. Of course I knew. He had the power, or so he believed. But what happened next? What did that silent and calculating woman do to overthrow the one she thought was in control? Revenge, when it finally happened, was cold, methodical, and devastating. The police officer who thought he was above everything and everyone, who believed he owned the system, discovered that justice can be much more lethal than he imagined, especially when it comes from someone he should never have underestimated. What did she know about him? How could such a deeply buried secret come back to destroy him? And, more importantly, how would she use this secret to come back and bring justice for all the times she was subjugated? You're about to find out. This story is just beginning. Kendra Lewis was born and raised on the streets of St. Louis, Missouri. The daughter of a factory worker and a public school teacher, she knew well the difficulties that life could impose, especially on a black woman in a city that always seemed to have something to prove. His childhood was marked by moments in which his family's efforts to overcome social barriers turned into a lesson in resilience. Her parents fought every day to ensure that Kendra and her two brothers had a solid education and, most importantly, understood the value of never bowing down in the face of adversity. With a sharp intellect and unwavering willpower, Kendra emerged early as an exceptional student. At school, she stood out among her classmates, always prepared, always determined to prove that she could go beyond what was expected of her. The looks of doubt or prejudice he received throughout his youth only served as fuel for his growth. She wanted more, not just for herself, but for those who, like her, had their abilities underestimated from the moment they entered any environment. At age 25, Kendra had already graduated with honors with a law degree from the University of Missouri. His resume was impeccable, but his struggle didn't end in the classroom or in the books. As a newly qualified lawyer, she quickly realized how deep the roots of discrimination ran, even within institutions that were supposed to serve justice. Driven by a determination to change this scenario, she pursued her legal career with a focus on protecting those who needed it most, the marginalized, the wronged, those who often had no voice. Eventually, Kendra's courage and dedication were recognized. She rose through the ranks of the judiciary, becoming a judge in St. Louis before she turned 40. Her reputation was immaculate, a woman who always stuck to her principles, guided by a firm belief in impartial justice. She did not bend to political or social pressure, and her name began to be respected, and feared, by those trying to corrupt the system. In an environment often dominated by white men of power, Kendra was an imposing presence. Not because of his physical stature, but because of the strength of his conviction. While Kendra was on the rise, another figure was emerging on the local scene, but in the opposite direction. Officer Richard Hale was a typical product of the system who believed he was above the law. Born into a family of police officers, he grew up with the mentality that the law was there to serve his interests. The uniform gave him a sense of invincibility, and his arrogance grew as his practices became more questionable. He knew how to play the game, how to manipulate the reports, how to create narratives that protected him from suspicion. However, behind his confident smile and hero-in-law facade, Richard had dark secrets he kept buried. Over the years, Richard has racked up a series of incidents of abuse of power. He planted evidence, manipulated witnesses, and used the color of his skin and badge to protect himself. However, the system always seemed to be in his favor, as if an invisible web protected him from the consequences. Some of his colleagues knew about his practices, but fear of reprisal kept them silent. Anyone who tried to confront him or report him quickly understood that the game was much bigger than it seemed. And so, Richard went unpunished. It was on one of these nights, in a seemingly routine approach, that Kendra and Richard's paths definitively crossed. Kendra was driving home after a long week of court work. The weight of difficult decisions and complex cases left a shadow in his eyes. Even though she was a respected judge, she never forgot that, in the eyes of many, she was still just another black woman. And that night would be a bitter reminder of that. When she saw the red and blue lights of the police car flash in her rearview mirror, she immediately felt a chill run down her spine. It wasn't the first time something like this had happened, and I knew exactly what to expect. But this time, something different hung in the air, like a storm about to break. Richard Hale followed her, ordering her to pull over. He didn't know who was behind the wheel, but in truth, it didn't matter to him. For Richard, it was just another opportunity to exercise his power. He approached the car with the arrogant posture of someone who had already decided that woman's fate before even exchanging a word with her. "Good evening, ma'am," he said, looking at the luxurious car. "It's a little late for you to be driving this way, don't you think?" Kendra remained calm. It wasn't his first time dealing with an unfair police stop, but as he looked at Richard's face, he felt a mixture of indignation and exhaustion. "I knew I was about to be treated as less than I was. Documents, please," he asked, with the impersonal tone that disguised the feeling of control he loved to exercise so much. She handed over the documents without arguing. I knew that arguing at that moment would be useless. There was no point in trying to educate someone who had already made up their mind. As Richard pretended to look through the papers, his mind was already plotting his next move. In an almost imperceptible movement, he removed a small package from his pocket and slid it under the passenger seat. A move he perfected over the years, creating cases against those he believed were suspects just for existing. "Looks like we found something here," he said, with a cynical smile on his face. The statement echoed in the silence, and Kendra felt her stomach drop. She knew what was happening. I had heard of officers like him, who used their power to oppress, to crush anyone who dared to challenge them. But this time, Richard had crossed a line from which he could never return. What he didn't know was that the woman he had humiliated was not just any victim. She was a judge, someone who knew the system better than he could ever imagine. What he had just done would have consequences far beyond what he was prepared to deal with. The silence inside the police station was heavy, suffocating. Kendra was sitting in the uncomfortable plastic chair, waiting to be called to give a statement. Her hands were resting on her lap, firm, but inside, the whirlwind of emotions almost suffocated her. Indignation burned in her veins, but she maintained a calm facade. The mask he had learned to wear from an early age, when the world seemed to test his self-control and resilience at every moment. Richard Hale walked past her, his face wearing that same superior smile. He seemed to enjoy the power he believed he had over her. It wasn't the first time he had planted evidence, fabricated a case and ruined someone's life, but this time it would be different. He just didn't know. "Well, you're going to spend a good time in prison," he said in a low tone, leaning slightly toward her, the words whispered with sick satisfaction. "Unless, of course, you want to confess right away." Kendra stared at him for a few seconds. There was something in her eyes that disturbed Richard, a kind of calm he didn't understand. It was as if she was waiting for something, but he couldn't see what. "Is that all you have?" Kendra said, her voice low, but carrying a weight he hadn't expected. "Is this how you win your battles? Planting evidence and hoping people will give up?" Richard laughed, but there was a slight hesitation in his laugh. He wasn't used to being confronted like this, and something about her tone made him feel uncomfortable. He had always been the hunter, the one pulling the strings, and his prey always followed the script: fear, denial, and ultimately despair. But this woman, she was acting different. He couldn't put his finger on why, but something about her wasn't right. "I do what I need to do to keep the streets safe," he replied, trying to hide his slight insecurity with words that, to him, sounded like justification. "People like you think they can get away with it, but not me." Kendra held his gaze, unfazed. There was a strength in her eyes that Richard didn't yet understand, but would soon discover. "I know exactly the kind of man you are," she continued, her voice cutting like a knife. "And I know that, in the end, the truth always finds a way to emerge." "The truth?" He laughed, a laugh full of disdain. "The truth is what I decide. No one will take your word against mine. I am the law here." Richard felt heat rising in his chest. The words came out sharper than he intended. There was a hint of irritation that he couldn't explain, as if something beyond his control was about to happen. But he quickly composed himself, convinced he was in control of the situation. "I think you'll discover that not everything is as you imagine," she murmured, calmly looking away as he looked at her, trying to decipher the enigmatic woman before him. Over the next few days, Kendra went through a series of formal interrogations and procedures. She knew the frame was solid, made to destroy someone who, in Richard's eyes, was unimportant. But what he didn't know was that she was already a few steps ahead. Kendra had been careful. The reputation she had built over the years was not just based on her position as a judge, but on her ability to anticipate problems, to always be prepared for the worst. Richard, on the other hand, was beginning to feel the weight of what he had done. At first, he ignored the growing discomfort. For him, it was just another day at work, another person to be crushed by the system he controlled. But as time passed, the feeling that something was about to get out of his control began to haunt him. One afternoon, already exhausted from going through bureaucratic procedures, Richard was called to the office of his superior, Chief Thompson. There, he was informed that Kendra's lawyer had requested a review of evidence. Something common, he thought. But what caught him by surprise was the presence of a witness. Witness? Richard questioned, frowning as he listened to his boss's words. Yes, someone claimed to have information about what really happened that night, Thompson said, crossing his arms, his gaze fixed on Richard, trying to read his reactions. Richard's stomach dropped. There were no witnesses. He had made sure of that. The area was isolated, and no one had seen anything. Or at least that's what he thought. Who is this person? He asked, trying to hide his growing anxiety. One name is still confidential, but they claim to have crucial information that could change the course of this case. The words kept echoing in Richard's mind. Something was wrong. Very wrong. He had done everything as usual, leaving no loose ends. But now, suddenly, there was a witness who could ruin everything. Meanwhile, Kendra waited, knowing the truth was about to emerge in a devastating way. She didn't know all the details of Richard's past, but she was sure that the setup against her wasn't his first time. There was something deeply rotten in his approach, something he had tried to keep hidden for a long time. And she was about to find out exactly what it was. "Are you feeling nervous, Richard?" said Thompson, in a casual tone, but with a slight touch of suspicion in his voice. The police officer smiled, trying to hide the fear that was beginning to take over his thoughts. He knew that if anything from his past came to light, everything he had built would fall apart. In that moment, Richard felt the world he knew begin to slowly crumble, like a storm approaching on the horizon, and he could do nothing to stop it. Something was about to happen. Something big. And Richard knew that, try as he might, he was no longer in control. What did Kendra know? How could an unexpected witness change everything? And what of Richard's past was about to come to light, shattering his lies and throwing his life into irreversible chaos? The atmosphere was tense, suffocating. Richard felt the weight of something invisible hanging over him as time slowly passed. He fidgeted restlessly in his chair, his fingers drumming on his office desk as if that would dispel his growing anxiety. Something had gotten out of control, and he knew it. The presence of an unexpected witness disturbed his mind, something he had not anticipated. Meanwhile, Kendra was in an adjacent room, waiting for everything to unfold. There was a calculated coldness in his expression. She wasn't nervous, nor was she uncertain. Her plan was underway, and each piece was beginning to fall into place, as if she had anticipated every move. Years of experience had prepared Kendra for this moment, and now she was on the brink of exposing a man who had always considered himself invincible. The door to the room opened, and Richard was called to the preliminary hearing. As he entered the room, he saw Kendra sitting on the other side of the table. Her posture was impeccable, her face serene, but her eyes held something that deeply disturbed him. She knew more than he realized. Kendra's lawyer stood up, opening the folder he was carrying, and began speaking with a firmness that reverberated through the room. "Before we proceed, I would like to present new evidence that has recently come to light," he said, holding up the papers with a fixed gaze on the judge present. Richard remained motionless, but sweat was beginning to accumulate on his forehead. He always knew how to deal with pressure situations, but this was different. Something was about to explode, and he didn't know where the blow would come from. "We have a witness who brings crucial information to this case," continued the lawyer. "This person was present at the scene, saw what really happened and is ready to testify. But, in addition, we gained access to documents from the past of one of those involved in this case, which will completely change the course of this trial." Richard's heart quickened. Documents from the past, he thought. That didn't make sense. He had cleared all traces, made sure nothing could connect him to his past mistakes. But even so, something was slipping out of his hands. Something he hadn't anticipated. "We would like to call the witness," announced the lawyer. The doors opened and a figure entered. Richard froze the moment he saw who it was. It couldn't be. That person was from his past, from a time when he thought all his transgressions were buried forever. It was someone he was sure would never come back to haunt him. "Please identify yourself for the court," asked the lawyer, the tension in the air almost palpable. The witness walked up to the podium, looked directly at Richard, and spoke in a firm voice. "My name is Darnell Jones. I am an eyewitness to an incident involving Officer Richard Hale 7 years ago." The room fell into a deep silence. Richard felt his entire body stiffen. He knew Darnell. He knew what had happened 7 years earlier, but he never imagined that it could resurface, much less now, at a time when his entire career and reputation were at stake. "And what kind of incident did you witness, Mr. Jones?" Kendra's lawyer asked, focusing on every word that came out of Darnell's mouth. "I saw Officer Hale manipulate evidence in a case very similar to this," he replied. "He planted drugs in an innocent man's car and fabricated accusations to frame him. And I was pressured into silence at the time." The accusation echoed through the room like thunder. The judge raised his eyebrows, his expression serious and restrained, as Richard felt the ground open beneath his feet. All eyes were on him, and for the first time, he couldn't hide the panic that was beginning to take over his expression. Kendra watched him closely. There was no rush in his movements, no need to speak. She knew the moment was unfolding exactly as it should. It was the truth coming out, as she had predicted. But there was more. The lawyer opened a new folder and handed documents to the judge. "Additionally, we have documentary evidence that shows that Officer Hale has been involved in a number of illicit activities in the past, including bribery and witness tampering. This confirms the pattern of conduct he has repeated throughout his career." Richard could barely process what was happening. How was this possible? How had someone managed to gather all that against him? He had always been careful, meticulous in his plans. But now, everything was falling apart before his eyes, and he couldn't find a way out. The room was dead silent, the weight of the revelations sinking like an anchor into Richard's chest. He had been exposed, and there was no escape. The past he tried so hard to hide was being revealed, detail by detail, without him being able to do anything to stop it. "Officer Hale, do you have anything to say in your defense?" asked the judge, breaking the silence with a firm but expectant voice. Richard opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. Fear and desperation were evident in his eyes, but his arrogance still held him back. He wouldn't admit it. "I couldn't admit it. Not yet." Kendra, until then silent, finally leaned forward, her gaze boring into Richard's. When she spoke, her voice was firm and carried with a calm that only heightened the impact of her words. "I warned you that the truth always comes out. And now, you will pay for every life you destroyed with your lies." What Richard didn't know was that Kendra had more tricks up her sleeve. Something he could never predict, something that would, in fact, end everything he had built definitively. The revelations that were to come, he could not even imagine. The tension in the air was almost suffocating. Richard felt like the world around him was crumbling, every word spoken in the room echoed like a hammer hitting the wall of his confidence, slowly destroying what was left of his self-defense. Darnell Jones continued his testimony, detailing what he had seen years ago and how Richard had manipulated every step of the way to get rid of the charges. "I kept silent out of fear," Darnell confessed, his voice wavering for the first time. "But I can't go on with this anymore. I saw many lives being destroyed. I saw men being arrested for crimes they didn't commit. And Officer Hale was involved in many of these cases." Richard clenched his fists under the table, sweat dripping down his forehead. With every second that passed, he felt his career, his life, slipping through his fingers. It was like being trapped in a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. Kendra's lawyer interrupted the testimony for a moment. "Mr. Jones, can you tell us what led you to finally come forward? What motivated you to break the silence now?" Darnell looked at Kendra, a silent exchange between the two. He then turned his gaze to the lawyer. "I received a letter," he said, in a firm voice. "A letter from the lady sitting over there," he pointed to Kendra, "asking me to be brave, to finally tell the truth. She promised me nothing in return except the chance to speak out for what was right. And that's what I decided to do." Kendra remained silent, watching Richard's every reaction. The man who once seemed so powerful was now wallowing in his own arrogance. He had believed that he would never face consequences, that he would never be held accountable for his actions. But now, Kendra was about to put an end to it. The lawyer then presented another document to the judge. "We have evidence here that Officer Hale has been involved in extortion, blackmail and bribery schemes in several cases over the past few years. These documents detail all of your transactions and contacts with individuals who were pressured to cooperate or face false accusations." The judge examined the documents carefully, and Richard knew that, at that moment, all was lost. The silence in the room was deafening, the feeling of defeat and despair was beginning to take hold of him in a way he had never experienced before. Then, Kendra slowly stood up. All eyes in the room turned to her. Her posture was impeccable, and when she finally spoke, her voice was like a sharp blade, cutting through the heavy air. "You tried to destroy me, just like you destroyed so many other lives. But what you didn't know, Richard, is that I already knew the game you were playing. I already knew who you were long before that night." Kendra remained standing, her gaze fixed on Richard, who now seemed small and defenseless in front of the room. The tension in the air grew with each second, each word she spoke adding to the weight on Richard's shoulders. "I've watched your pattern for years, Richard." Kendra's voice sounded like thunder, low but full of authority. "You planted evidence, destroyed families, and hid behind the badge. You didn't know it, but your mistakes started to follow you. Every case you faked, every life you destroyed, was recorded in one way or another. And now, finally, you will pay." The silence in the room was absolute. Richard felt sweat running down his face, and despair took over every part of his body. He had believed he was untouchable, that the system would always protect him. But now, with Kendra in front of him, everything he had built on lies was crumbling. Kendra's lawyer spoke again, this time with an even more confident, almost triumphant tone. "We would like to introduce one more piece of evidence," he said, while handing a small flash drive to the judge. "This is a recording made by Judge Lewis the night Officer Hale tried to frame her. This recording, taken from nearby security cameras, clearly shows the moment Officer Hale planted the evidence in the judge's car. The shock that spread through the room was palpable. Richard turned white as a sheet. He knew there were cameras on the streets, but he always trusted his ability to choose the right moments and places to commit his frauds. He never imagined that that night, in that specific place, there would be a hidden camera, capturing everything he did. The judge received the flash drive with a serious expression, asking for the evidence to be displayed immediately. The video began to play in the room, and all eyes turned to the screen. The recording was clear and precise. It showed Richard reaching into his pocket and, with one quick movement, sliding the small package of drugs under the seat of Kendra's car. There was no denying it. The evidence was there, in plain sight. Richard felt the blood drain from his face. He looked around the room, looking for some support, some way to escape this situation, but there was no one who could help him now. His boss, Thompson, was impassive, observing every detail with a grave expression. Richard knew that, at that moment, even the superiors who had once protected him were ready to turn their backs on him. Kendra remained standing, unfazed. She knew this was the moment everything changed. The truth was finally in front of everyone, and the empire of lies that Richard had built was crumbling. You trusted that the system would always be on your side, Kendra said, without taking her eyes off Richard. You thought you could continue destroying lives without facing the consequences. But today, the truth finally caught up with you. Richard tried to mumble something, but his voice seemed to catch in his throat. He looked at the judge, waiting for an intervention, a word of defense, but the silence remained crushing. The room was filled with a sense of imminent justice, something everyone there knew was coming. The judge interrupted the silence. "Officer Hale," he said, his voice heavy with authority. "The evidence presented here is clear. There is enough evidence to file a case against you for falsifying evidence, abuse of power and manipulation of the judicial system. You will be placed in pre-trial detention while we await formal trial." Those words were like a death sentence for Richard. He felt his legs tremble, the air felt heavier, almost impossible to breathe. In all his years of service, he had never imagined that the system, which he manipulated so many times, would turn against him. "This is a trap," Richard shouted, desperate, trying to grab any chance to get out of that situation. "I didn't do any of that. You are conspiring against me." But his words fell on deaf ears. No one in the room believed his excuses anymore. His career, his reputation, everything he had built on corruption, was crumbling. The judge continued, implacable. "Given the evidence presented in Mr. Jones' testimony, there is no doubt that your actions violated not only the law, but also the trust that the community placed in you. It's closed. Officers, take him into custody." Two police officers approached Richard, who was still trying to protest, but there was nothing more he could do. He was handcuffed right there, in front of everyone, and led out of the room. Kendra watched as he was taken away. She didn't say anything else. There was no need. Justice, one way or another, had finally prevailed. Richard Hale, the man who had so often escaped his frauds, would now face the consequences of his actions. But there was something else in the air. Something that still hung over everyone in the room. A feeling that, however much justice had been done, this was just the beginning of a long journey to repair the damage Richard had caused to so many lives. Kendra knew this wasn't the end. She still had much work to do, not only to ensure that men like Richard never again subjugated the system, but also to heal the wounds it had opened. With Richard out of the room, the silence felt heavier than ever. Kendra stood firm, knowing that the cycle of injustice had finally been broken. She took a deep breath and allowed herself a brief moment of satisfaction. An important battle had been won. But the fight for justice never ended. The courtroom was empty now except for Kendra, her lawyer, and the judge who was flipping through some closing documents. The sound of the doors closing behind Richard as he was taken into custody still reverberated in everyone's minds. The echo of that victory, however, did not erase the weight of reality that Kendra now carried with her. Justice had been served, but the process was far from simple, or even satisfactory. Kendra slowly got up from her chair. His eyes, once firm and determined, now reflected something deeper, exhaustion. It was not just the physical exhaustion of a battle that had demanded so much from her, but an emotional exhaustion that only those who know the ins and outs of injustice can understand. Richard Hale had been unmasked, and his downfall was inevitable. However, there was something darker and more complex behind that victory. As his lawyer packed the documents into his briefcase, he turned to Kendra, realizing the weight of the situation. "You got what you wanted," he said, trying to ease the tension with a soft tone. "He will be judged, and what he did to you and so many others will not go unpunished." Kendra nodded slightly, but didn't respond right away. She knew that even though Richard was out of the loop, the system that allowed him to thrive was still intact. He did not act alone. There was a network of police officers, lawyers and court officials who had somehow benefited from his corruption, or at least chosen to look the other way. "It's not the end," Kendra finally murmured, her distant gaze fixed somewhere beyond the room. "It's just the beginning. There are many others like him, hidden, protected by the shadows of the power they think they control." The lawyer sighed, understanding her point of view. "I knew Kendra wasn't a woman who would rest on a superficial victory. She was on a much bigger mission than just taking down a single man." "We have to start somewhere," he replied. "Richard was an important piece, but I understand what you mean. There is more to come." Kendra knew the road to real justice was long and painful. The feeling of victory was temporary. There were many lives that Richard had destroyed throughout his career. People who would never make up for lost time behind bars, families who would never be the same. The justice served there was a step in the right direction, but it did not correct the decades of accumulated harm. Leaving the room, the fresh air outside brought with it a moment of clarity. She looked out at the skyline, at the city of St. Louis, and thought about the countless times people, like her, had been stopped unfairly, treated with contempt, and had their lives destroyed by those they were supposed to protect. Kendra couldn't help but wonder, how many more like Richard Hale were still in their positions, feeling invincible. And, more than that, how far should she go to take down this network of corruption? The moral dilemma now was not just about immediate justice, but about the larger impact of his journey. How far must a person go to ensure that the system they believe in is free from rot? She knew that every victory came with its own burden, and the price was high. As she walked toward the parking lot, Kendra felt the weight of her next step. Richard was just the beginning. She had brought justice for herself, but she knew that for many others, that battle was far from over. Darnell Jones, for example. He had finally found the courage to testify, but what did that mean for his life from now on? Would he be able to move on? Or would the weight of the past still hold him back? As I pondered, Kendra's phone vibrated. A message from his lawyer: "The formal trial will be soon. Let's prepare for what comes next." She knew the next few days would be a roller coaster of emotions, testimonies and more revelations. There would be retaliation, and she was ready for it. But what about the others? Would there be more victims willing to stand up and fight? Would there be more voices willing to speak now that Richard had fallen? Kendra needed to be more than a judge who brought justice to herself. She needed to be a beacon for everyone who couldn't defend themselves. In that moment, she understood that her mission was bigger than Richard Hale. She was the voice of those who had been silenced, those who, like Darnell, carried the trauma of fear. And as much as his own story had reached a turning point, the larger narrative, the battle for justice in a corrupted system, was just beginning. Richard's fall was the first domino. Now the real work began. She would need allies, she would need strength to continue. But, above all, she would need something that has always guided her, the certainty that she was on the right side of history, no matter how difficult the path ahead. With a deep sigh, Kendra got into the car and drove off, while her mind worked tirelessly on her next steps. The climax of her personal battle had passed, but the consequences of that victory still reverberated in every decision she would make from then on. As she drove through the streets of St. Louis, she thought about the lives Richard had affected, the lives she could now save. The fight against injustice was not a sprint, but a marathon. And Kendra Lewis was just starting her run. Richard Hale's trial was quickly scheduled, and the impact of his fall reverberated throughout the city. The media was in full force in the courtroom when the case began, with headlines highlighting the police corruption scandal and the participation of Kendra Lewis, the judge who, by a twist of fate, had been the target of an attempted incrimination. But now, instead of being in the dock, she was in her place of strength, closely following the trial that would end Hale's career once and for all. The room was packed. People came not only to see justice done, but to witness the end of a cycle of abuse and power. Many of those there were Richard's victims, men and women who were framed by him, lives he ruined. They wanted to see with their own eyes the fall of a man who believed he was above the law. When the trial began, the evidence was so clear and irrefutable that there was not much room for defense maneuvers. The recordings, the depositions, the documents, everything pointed directly to Richard. His once arrogant and confident demeanor now reflected a broken man. He knew that the system that once protected him was now turning against him, and there was no way out. Darnell Jones, who had been one of the first to testify against Hale, took the witness stand once again. This time, his voice was firmer, more assured. There was no longer fear in his eyes, just an unshakable conviction that he was doing the right thing. Darnell's testimony was one of the final blows for Richard. He described in detail what he witnessed years ago, how Richard planted evidence and manipulated cases. The court listened intently, and the expression on Richard's face deteriorated with each word. "I've been silent for a long time, but I will no longer allow men like him to destroy lives with impunity," Darnell said firmly, looking directly at Richard. "This is the end of your reign of terror." When the sentence was read, the room was filled with murmurs. Richard Hale, the police officer who had for so long escaped the consequences of his actions, was sentenced to a long prison sentence for corruption, falsifying evidence and abuse of power. His fall was abrupt and relentless. The man who had manipulated the system so many times was now in his hands, with no escape. As the officers handcuffed him and led him out of the room, Kendra watched silently. There was no celebration on his part, just a sigh of relief. Justice had been done, but the road to get there had been painful and exhausting. Richard had finally faced the consequences of his choices, and the system he believed he controlled had shown that, however flawed it was, it could still correct its mistakes. Kendra returned to court days later, this time to resume her work as a judge. But something about her had changed. The battle against Richard Hale made her stronger, more convinced of her mission. She knew that the justice system still had a lot to improve, that the Hales of the world still existed, and that the fight for equity was far from over. But at that moment, she also knew that she had taken an important step. Her life would never be the same, and what she faced changed her. Now more than ever, Kendra was committed to making sure others didn't go through what she did. She would continue to use her position to bring justice to victims, to expose the corrupt, and to dismantle the cycles of abuse that so many suffered in silence. The public also began to see Kendra differently. Not just as a judge, but as a symbol of resistance, a woman who fought against the odds and won. There was something inspiring about her journey, and she knew that even though her fight was far from over, the impact she made was real and profound. Darnell Jones also found a path to redemption. Testifying against Richard wasn't easy, but it was the first step toward his own emotional freedom. He carried the guilt of remaining silent for so long, but now he knew he had done what was right. With the case closed, Darnell decided to become an active voice in the community, helping others who were victims of police abuse find the courage to speak out. He approached Kendra after the trial, and together they started a community project that offered legal assistance to those who could not afford a lawyer, often those most vulnerable to corruption. Darnell had found a new purpose, and his journey, like Kendra's, was just beginning. The story of Kendra Lewis and Richard Hale is not just a narrative about justice against corruption. It is a reflection on power, morality and the strength necessary to confront systems that, at times, seem unshakable. At some point, we all face dilemmas that test our limits. How far are we willing to go to ensure the truth prevails? What are we willing to sacrifice in the name of justice? Kendra chose to fight, even though she knew the battle would be long and full of obstacles. His story reminds us that justice does not always come quickly, and that those responsible are not always punished immediately. But in the end, the truth has a way of emerging, no matter how hard they try to bury it. And you? How would you have acted in Kendra's place? Would you have continued forward, even in the face of so much adversity? Or would I have backed down, given in to pressure? Kendra's story is a reminder that silence can be as dangerous as the actions of those who oppress. In the end, what really matters is standing up when injustice tries to crush us. Now that we have reached the end of this impactful story, I want to know your opinion. What did you think? How did this story resonate with you? Leave in the comments what impacted you most, and subscribe to the channel Tales of Twist for more exciting stories full of twists and turns. Don't forget to like and share this video with anyone you think needs to hear this story. Justice is a constant struggle, and every voice makes a difference. Until next time.